The most dangerous spy Israel ever ran inside Iran never carried a weapon. She carried a prayer mat. Every morning, for 6 years, she woke before dawn in a city that would have executed her on sight, unrolled that mat, and faced Mecca. Not because she had to. Because by that point, she no longer knew where the performance ended and the person began. Her name, the name they gave her, was Fatime. She was not Iranian. She was not Muslim, not originally. She had been born into a secular Jewish family in France, raised in a country where her grandparents' survival of the Nazi occupation was treated as a quiet, permanent inheritance. She had studied psychology. She had 2 master's degrees. She had, at one point, been a consultant to the United Nations Security Council on Yemen. None of that prepared her for what she would become inside that house in Tehran. She had access to the wives of men whose names appear on no public record. Men who commanded units that Israel had been trying to map for decades. She sat in their living rooms. She held their children. She attended their funerals. And everything she heard. At dinner tables, in hospital waiting rooms, at religious seminars where women spoke freely because they believed no one outside was listening, moved through a chain that eventually ended in Tel Aviv. For 6 years, no one inside Iran confirmed what she was. And yet there was a woman at a gathering in Tehran who had been watching her for months. A woman who had noticed something. A woman who had not yet decided what to do about it. That is where this story begins. Not at the ending, at the moment before everything became irreversible. If a story like this one holds you, the ebook linked below in the description goes where the video cannot. It is the record of the women and men who built these methods long before her. The long legends. The ones who became someone else so completely they could never fully come back. The link is in the description. Now back to Tehran. Here is something the intelligence world rarely admits. The best deep cover operatives are almost never recruited as blank slates. You cannot train someone in a facility in 18 months to pass as a devout Shia Muslim woman inside the social world of Iran's revolutionary elite. The language alone would take years. The religious knowledge, not the surface practice, but the granular interior fluency that comes from having lived inside a community, cannot be installed through curriculum. The mannerisms, the social rhythms, the specific way a woman of that world moves through a room of other women who know each other's families going back 3 generations. None of that is learnable in the time intelligence services have. What Mossad found, in the case of the woman who would become Fatime, was someone who had already done most of the work herself. She had met a Yemeni Muslim man in London while completing her postgraduate studies. The relationship was real, not an operation, not a setup. She converted to Islam for the marriage. She moved with him to Yemen. She spent 4 years living as a Muslim wife in a Muslim country, absorbing a world that most Western-born Jewish women never encounter from the inside. She wore the hijab not as a disguise, but as the ordinary requirement of the life she was then living. The marriage eventually ended. She left Yemen. She returned to Europe. But she did not leave the world entirely. She began writing, political analysis, commentary on Shia theology, essays on Iran's revolutionary ideology that were notable in the circles where they circulated for their unusual fluency. She was not writing as an outsider explaining the inside. She was writing as someone who had genuinely absorbed a perspective and was now engaging with it intellectually. Iranian media noticed. She was invited to conferences. She began publishing in outlets connected to Iran's ideological infrastructure, including, eventually, the website of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei himself. In 2017, she traveled to Iran and conducted an exclusive interview with a man named Ibrahim Raisi, then a presidential candidate. She accompanied him on the campaign trail. She sat with him in private. She was trusted in rooms where foreign journalists were not. She also met, in Karbala, during a pilgrimage to the Shia holy sites in Iraq, a man named Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the IRGC Quds force, the architect of Iran's entire regional proxy strategy. one of the most protected, most surveilled, most consequential military figures in the Middle East. She was photographed with him, casually, as if this were simply a thing that happened. At some point before any of this, the exact timing is not confirmed, a conversation took place. The nature of that conversation is not publicly documented. What is documented is what came after it. A woman who had, through her own choices and her own trajectory, arrived at the exact threshold that an intelligence operation would have spent years trying to construct artificially, and who then stepped across it. The first unresolved question of the operation was one that would never fully close. She was not a trained operative. She had not gone through the processes that produce professionals who know, precisely and procedurally, how to manage risk and maintain separation. She was someone with genuine access, genuine knowledge, and a genuine presence in a world that mattered, but also someone who had her own reasons for being in that world. Her own complicated relationship with what she was doing, and her own interior life that no handler fully controlled. That was an asset. It was also the source of everything that would eventually become dangerous. The second unresolved question was structural. The cover she would operate under was not a fabrication built on nothing. It was a fabrication built on something real. Her actual history, the conversion, the marriage, the years in Yemen, the published articles, the conference appearances, was genuine. It could be verified. Anyone investigating her would find a coherent, documentable trail. The problem with a cover that is partially true is that it has to be maintained in proportion to what is actually true. She could not distance herself from the positions she had publicly held without creating a contradiction. She could not suddenly begin expressing views inconsistent with 6 years of public writing. The cover and the person were not separate. They were overlapping. And where they overlapped, the line between intelligence work and personal belief was not always visible. She arrived in Iran presenting herself as exactly what her public record suggested she was: a French-born journalist of Jewish origin who had converted to Shia Islam, who had developed a genuine intellectual and spiritual commitment to the revolutionary worldview, who was critical of Israel and of Western foreign policy, and who wanted to understand the Islamic Republic from within. Iranian authorities found this credible. They had reason to. It was, in its essential elements, true. What was not true was what she was doing with what she learned. She began attending religious seminars in Qom, the theological center of Shia Islam in Iran, where the wives of senior clerics and IRGC officers gathered in environments closed to men and closed to foreigners, environments where, precisely because they felt protected, women spoke without the caution they applied in public. She was welcomed into these gatherings because she was introduced by people who vouched for her, people who had no reason to suspect her because they had known her, in some form, for years. The intelligence she was positioned to gather was not technical. It was human. It was the kind of information that no satellite collects and no signals interception captures. Where a commander's unit had been deployed, when a husband had been called away unexpectedly, which names produced lowered voices and changed subjects, which families were connected to which operations through the ordinary, unself-conscious disclosures of domestic life. She was not extracting this information through questioning. She was absorbing it the way anyone absorbs information when they are present in a social environment long enough, passively, continuously, and with an understanding of what mattered. By the end of her first year inside that world, she had access that Mossad's technical operations could not replicate. She had also, by the end of that first year, made a discovery that no one in the operation had anticipated. One of the women in her social circle, the wife of a mid-level IRGC intelligence officer, had begun to watch her differently than the others did. Not with hostility, not with suspicion in any official sense. With the particular quality of attention that belongs to a person who has noticed something they cannot yet name. The woman had not reported this attention to anyone. She had not escalated it. She had simply begun to watch. What she had noticed and what she intended to do with it was not something Fatime could know. That uncertainty, present from the end of the first year, impossible to resolve, impossible to eliminate, would remain inside the operation for the next 5 years. The second year was the year she stopped counting days. That is not a metaphor. In the first year, operatives in deep cover placements often maintain a private mental accounting, a running awareness of how long they have been inside, how long until a scheduled contact, how many weeks since they last spoke to anyone who knew who they actually were. It is a form of psychological anchoring, a way of preserving the knowledge that the constructed life is constructed. At some point in the second year, she stopped doing that. The religious seminars in calm had become routine, not comfortable. The word comfortable implies a kind of ease that does not belong in an environment where the wrong answer to a casual question carries consequences no Western legal system would recognize. But routine. She knew which women arrived early. She knew who sat where. She knew the particular silences that preceded certain topics and the particular expansiveness that followed others. She knew the names of children who did not attend but were talked about constantly. This is what deep cover work produces when it is working. Not a performance of belonging, actual belonging. And the thing about actual belonging is that it does not feel dangerous. It feels like being somewhere familiar. That feeling was itself the first fracture. There was a woman named Zara, not her real name, but the name that appears in reconstructed accounts of the operation, who had become something Fatime had not been authorized to have. A genuine friend, not a source, not a contact, not a relationship managed for access. A person whose company she sought, whose observations she found herself thinking about later, whose children she had watched grow from infants into small people with personalities. Zara's husband was a colonel in the IRGC's intelligence division. His name, his unit, his operational portfolio, these were things Fatime had learned, incrementally and carefully through 2 years of proximity. They were things that had passed, in appropriately fragmented form, through the chain that led to Tel Aviv. Zara did not know this. What Zara knew was that Fatime was the kind of person she could call at 11 at night when her husband had not come home and she was frightened and did not want to alarm her own family. She had called. Twice, Fatime had answered. She had stayed on the telephone for a long time, saying the things a friend says, which is to say, the things that are true regardless of what else is also true about the person saying them. This was the architecture of trust that the operation had built. And it was the architecture of trust that now made the operation impossible to conduct cleanly. Because the information Zara disclosed in those late-night calls, the operational absences of her husband, the patterns of his deployment, the names of the men he was with when he was not at home, was precisely the category of intelligence the operation existed to collect. And the instrument for collecting it was a relationship that had, from Fatime's side, become real. A lie that creates a new problem does not always look like a tactical failure. Sometimes it looks like a friendship. The contact who managed her from outside Iran, communications were conducted through a method that has not been publicly described in detail, but which involved intermediaries who themselves did not understand the full structure they were part of, had noted the shift in her reporting. The intelligence was better, more granular, more reliable, more consistent with what other collection methods were producing independently. The quality of what she was passing had increased markedly from the first year to the second, and continued to increase into the third. What had also changed was the texture of her communication, the language she used when describing her situation, the way she framed her own position inside the social world she was inhabiting. She was no longer describing it from outside. She was describing it from within. The contact raised this. Not in the language of concern, the operational relationship does not tend to accommodate emotional registers, but as a question of risk management. An operative who has genuine relationships inside a target environment is an operative who has acquired genuine obligations inside that environment. Obligations are risks. Obligations create hesitation. Hesitation, in a moment where a split-second decision is required, is the operational word for the thing that gets people killed. She was told, in language she later characterized as clinical, that the operation required her to maintain the relationships, because the relationships were the method, but to remember, to actively practice remembering that they were instruments. She did not say, in response to this, what she thought about it. What she did, in the weeks following that exchange, was begin to do what the operation required. She collected what Zara told her, reported it accurately, and continued to answer the phone at 11 at night. The fracture this created was not visible from the outside. It was the kind of fracture that lives entirely inside a person. The knowledge that you are doing something to someone who trusts you, and that the trust is real, and that you are using the reality of it as the mechanism of the using. She maintained the cover. That is what the record shows. But what the record cannot show is what maintaining it cost. In the 3rd year, there was an abort discussion. It was not initiated by her. It was initiated by the people who were running the operation, in response to a development that had nothing to do with her cover directly, but which altered the risk calculus of keeping her in place. An Iranian counterintelligence unit had begun an investigation into the networks surrounding a separate Mossad operation, an operation she had no connection to, conducted through entirely different channels. The investigation was not about her. It was not pointed at her social environment. But investigations in Iran's security apparatus have a tendency to widen in unpredictable directions, and there was a non-trivial probability that widening would eventually produce proximity to her. The abort discussion lasted, from what can be reconstructed, through several communication cycles. The argument for extraction was straightforward. The marginal intelligence value of continued placement did not justify the exposure risk created by an active counterintelligence sweep in the general operational environment. She had been in place for 3 years. She had produced significant intelligence. She had a viable extraction pathway. The sensible professional decision was to use it. The argument against extraction was also straightforward, and it came, at least partly, from her. She had spent 3 years building something that could not be rebuilt quickly. The access she had was not replicable. The relationships she had formed, the trust she had accumulated, the position she had arrived at inside a social world that did not admit strangers easily, none of that could be recreated in a year, or 2 years, or perhaps at all. If she left now, the operation did not pause. It ended. There was a second argument she did not make explicitly, but which was present in the way she framed her position. She had built a life, not a real life, she understood the distinction, intellectually, but a life in the operational sense. A set of relationships, commitments, patterns of presence that other people had organized their own expectations around. Zara expected her to be at the Calm seminar in 3 weeks. The women who had known her for 3 years expected her to continue being the person she had demonstrated herself to be. The extraction would require her to simply not appear. And then, not appear again. And eventually to become a person who had, from the perspective of everyone who knew her in Tehran, simply vanished. She knew what that would mean to Zara. She did not put it in those terms, but the operational case she made, the argument about irreplaceable access, about the architecture of trust that had taken 3 years to build, was not separable from the personal case she was also making, and could not make directly. The operation continued. The Irk wife, who had been watching her from the end of the 1st year, had still not moved. This was now a known element of the operation's risk profile. Not a confirmed threat, she had taken no action, filed no report, escalated nothing through any channel that had been detected. But a persistent variable. A person who had noticed something had chosen not to act on it yet, and whose reasons for that choice were entirely opaque. What Fatime had learned, through the ordinary channels of a social world where women talked to each other, was something about this woman's situation that made the silence slightly more comprehensible and substantially more complicated. The Irk wife had, for reasons connected to her own private life, things she did not want examined. What those things were is not the point. The point is that they created a mutual exposure, a symmetry of risk. Two women in the same social environment, each of whom had reason to leave the other alone. This was not, by any interpretation, a stable situation. A silence based on mutual risk is not protection. It is a negotiation conducted without words, between two people who have not confirmed that they understand the terms, in an environment where one of them had the institutional machinery of a revolutionary state available if she ever decided the negotiation was no longer worth maintaining. The operation had survived 3 years on access, tradecraft, and a genuine social architecture that took time and skill to construct. It was now also surviving on the silence of a woman whose reasons for staying silent could change. What it would take to change them was the question no one inside the operation could answer. The 4th year began with what felt, from inside the operation, like confirmation. Not confirmation of a specific piece of intelligence, confirmation of the rarer and more dangerous thing, confirmation that the cover had fully taken. That she was no longer being processed by the social world around her as a foreign woman who had chosen this life, but simply as a woman who had this life. The distinction sounds minor. It is not. It is the difference between a guest who is watched and a resident who is not. The particular moment that produced this sense of confirmation was ordinary. It was so ordinary that she almost did not register its significance until afterward. A woman she had known for 2 years, the wife of a mid-ranking Quds Force officer, asked her, at a gathering, to settle a minor dispute about a religious observance, not asked her opinion, asked her to adjudicate, as you would ask someone whose knowledge you had come to take for granted. She gave the answer. The correct answer, as it happened, because 6 years of immersion, 4 in Yemen, 2 inside Iran, had produced knowledge that was genuine enough to be reliable. The dispute was settled. The conversation moved on. What she carried away from that moment was the sense that something had been confirmed, that the architecture of the previous 3 years had achieved the thing it was designed to achieve, that she was inside in a way that could now be used more deliberately. This was the misjudgment. The intelligence she was positioned to gather had, to this point, been largely passive. She was present. People talked. She listened and remembered and passed along what mattered in appropriately fragmented forms. This was valuable. It was also, from the standpoint of the people directing the operation, limited by the fact that she could only hear what was said in rooms she was already in. The shift that was proposed, entering the 4th year, was a movement from passive collection to something more deliberate. Not questioning, she was not to begin asking things she had no natural reason to ask, but positioning. Cultivating proximity to specific women whose husbands occupied specific roles in ways that would increase the probability of certain conversations occurring. She understood the instruction. She also understood that it required her to make a calculation she had not previously been required to make explicitly, which of her friendships she was willing to deliberately deepen as a professional act. She began with a woman she knew slightly, not Zara, but someone in the same social orbit, whose husband's portfolio overlapped with a specific area of interest the operation had identified. The cultivation was careful, patient, and for the first 2 months entirely unproductive. The woman was warm, but not forthcoming. She spoke about her children, her domestic life, the general difficulties of maintaining a household when a husband's schedule was not his own. She did not speak about the husband's work. After 2 months of this, Fatime made a decision that, in retrospect, constituted the operation's first false start. She attempted to accelerate the relationship. Not clumsily, there was no single moment that could be pointed to as an error. But the pace of intimacy she introduced was slightly ahead of where the relationship naturally was, and the woman she was cultivating, who was herself not unsophisticated, noticed the acceleration without being able to name it. What followed was not a rupture. It was a cooling. The woman remained friendly in the context of group gatherings. She simply stopped accepting the particular kind of proximity that had been on offer. The relationship settled into a cordial distance and stayed there. Nothing was broken. Nothing was confirmed as suspicious. But one avenue closed, and it closed because she had pushed when the moment required patience. The false start produced something useful, though not in the way she had intended. The woman she had overcultivated said nothing directly, but she mentioned, in conversation with another woman in the social circle, that Fatime was perhaps, the word she used, as it was later reconstructed, was eager. That was all. One mild word, said in passing, not as accusation, as observation. The word reached the Irkwife, who had been watching her since the first year. The Irkwife did not escalate it. She filed it, internally, in whatever way people file things they are accumulating rather than acting on. But she now had 2 data points where before she had 1. The accent anomaly from the first year. And now this. Eager, in a context where eagerness had no obvious explanation. For the first time, the watching became something more structured. Not surveillance, she was not being followed, not being monitored technically, but intentional. The Irkwife began with the particular patience of a person who understands that the value of an observation depends on what you do with it, to test the edges. She did this the way it is done in closed social environments, which is through conversation. She raised topics, at gatherings, that someone with genuine religious roots would respond to one way, and someone with constructed knowledge would respond to another. She observed the hesitations. She noted the answers that were correct but arrived at slightly too late, in the way that a person arrives at a conclusion through reasoning rather than recognition. Fatime did not know this was happening. Not yet. She was managing other things. The near abort came from an unexpected direction. A man not connected to her operational network, not connected to the IRGC social world, made contact with someone she had known in her European life, before Iran. The contact was innocent in origin. He was trying to locate her for reasons connected to a publication dispute, something trivial and entirely legitimate. But the effort to locate her produced, through a chain of inquiries she only learned about afterward, a question in an environment where questions about her were not safe. Someone who knew her in Tehran was asked, by an intermediary, whether they knew how to reach the French writer. The question was passed along, through ordinary social channels, without any understanding of what it might mean. It reached, within 2 weeks, a woman in her social circle, who mentioned it casually at a gathering. Had anyone heard from the French writer recently? Someone in Europe was looking for her. The casualness of the mention was what made it dangerous. A formal inquiry could be managed. A formal inquiry had edges, could be tracked, could be responded to through the appropriate channels of a managed cover. A casual social mention spreading through a network of women who communicated freely among themselves was a different category of problem entirely. She could not know how many people it had reached. She could not know who, among the people it had reached, might find it worth noting alongside something else they had already noticed. She did not report the contact immediately. This was the first significant departure from operational procedure in 4 years. She spent 4 days deciding whether to report it, which was itself a form of misjudgment. The delay resolved nothing, and introduced a gap in the record that her handlers noticed when she finally communicated. The near abort conversation was brief. The position from outside was that the passive exposure created by an uncontrolled social inquiry warranted serious consideration of immediate extraction. The risk was not large. But it was uncontrolled, which was a different kind of risk than a large one, because uncontrolled risks cannot be managed by doing things correctly. She argued, again, to stay. This time the argument was accepted more reluctantly. The condition attached to the decision to continue was that she would report any anomaly, any contact, any question, any irregularity in the behavior of people around her, within 24 hours. She agreed. She meant it. 3 weeks later came the moment that felt like release. The Irkwife, The woman who had been watching, who had been quietly accumulating observations and testing edges, did something unexpected. At a gathering, in front of several other women, she made a point of publicly vouching for Fatime. The context was a mild challenge from a woman newer to the social circle, who had asked, without particular edge, how long Fatime had been in Iran. The Irk wife answered before Fatime could. She had been here long enough, she said, that the question was no longer interesting. It was a small act. It was also a public act, witnessed by 6 or 7 other women. What Fatime felt in that moment, and what she reported afterward, was relief. 3 years of awareness that this woman had been watching. And now a public statement that amounted to endorsement. She interpreted it as the watching having reached a conclusion. A verdict in her favor. She reported the incident. Her handler noted it. The assessment that came back was measured. This could indicate that the watching was complete and she had been found credible. Or it could indicate something else, something that did not yet have a shape. She chose the interpretation that felt true. That night, for the first time in 4 years, she slept without the particular alertness that had become her resting state. The Irk wife, across the city, had her own reasons for what she had said. They had nothing to do with what Fatime had decided they meant. The question at the religious gathering in Tehran was not designed to expose her. That was the problem. It was the kind of question that arises naturally in those environments, a specific inquiry about a devotional practice observed in a particular province, asked by a woman visiting from Mossad who was simply making conversation. There was no trap in it. There was no architecture of suspicion behind it. It was asked the way people ask things when they are among people they trust, which is without calculation. She gave the answer. It was close. It was accurate in its broad shape and slightly wrong in its texture. The answer of someone who had learned this practice from scholarship rather than from childhood, from reading rather than from a grandmother who had performed it in a particular way in a particular kitchen. The answer of someone whose knowledge, however extensive, had a ceiling that genuine formation does not have. The woman from Mossad accepted it and moved the conversation forward. But the Irk wife was in that room. The same woman who, 3 weeks earlier, had publicly vouched for her in front of 6 other women. The woman whose endorsement she had interpreted as a verdict. The woman she had finally, after 4 years of awareness, allowed herself to stop watching with the same constancy she had previously maintained. She saw the hesitation. She heard the recovery. She noted the answer's shape, correct, not instinctive, and placed it next to the other things she had been placing next to each other for 4 years. The accent anomaly from year 1. The word eager reported back from a woman she had overcultivated in year 4. And now this, a devotional question, a correct answer, and a pause that was a fraction of a second too long. 3 data points do not constitute evidence. In Iran's security apparatus, they constitute a reason to ask someone who can do something with them. She did not know, walking home from that gathering, that anything had shifted. The Irk wife had given nothing away. There had been no change in her manner, no alteration in the social temperature of the room. The gathering had ended the way gatherings end. Women had embraced at the door. Plans had been made for the following month. She had 4 days before she understood that something had broken. The understanding came not through an official channel, but through Zara. Zara called, not at 11 at night, not in distress, but in the middle of the afternoon, with a quality in her voice that was performing normalcy in a way that normalcy does not need to perform. She asked about nothing in particular. She talked for longer than usual without saying anything. At the end of the call, she mentioned, in a tone designed to carry no weight, that there had been some conversation, she did not say among whom, about whether it might be a good time for Fatime to visit family abroad. The phrasing was careful. It was the kind of careful that belongs to a person who is delivering a message they have been asked to deliver in a way that allows everyone to later say no message was delivered. She understood it immediately. The call ended. She sat with what she had just been told. Zara had warned her. a woman who did not know what she was, who had been called at 11 at night and listened to and treated as a person whose fear mattered. That woman had, through the only channel available to her, told the person she trusted to leave. This was the direct consequence of the cultivation that had never been purely professional. Zara's loyalty was to Fatime the person, not to whatever Fatime the person might actually be. The warmth had been real enough to produce a warning. The warning was possible only because the warmth had been used to produce access. The same instrument that had made the operation work had just saved her life. She reported the call within the hour. The extraction was not immediate. This is a detail that matters, because the operational logic of the delay reveals something about how intelligence services weigh their assets. The guidance she received was to maintain normal patterns for a period that was measured in weeks, not days. An abrupt departure following a social gathering would be, itself, a form of confirmation. A gradual absence, a health matter, a family visit, the ordinary slow withdrawal of someone whose circumstances have shifted, was operationally cleaner. She attended one more gathering. She sat in a room with the Irk wife who had undone 4 years of careful positioning with a 3-second observation she had not even framed as a report. She sat with Zara, who did not look at her differently, who maintained the performance of normalcy with the same precision that Fatime herself had been maintaining a different performance for 6 years. 2 women in the same room, both performing, neither acknowledging what they both now knew. She left Iran 6 weeks after the gathering in Tehran. She did not say goodbye to anyone. She had been told not to. The intelligence produced by 6 years of placement did not sit inert in a file. It moved. It was cross-referenced against signals data, against the output of other collection streams, against the technical surveillance that operates in parallel with human intelligence, and requires human intelligence to interpret correctly what a commander's wife says about her husband's absence, set against what a satellite sees at a facility 3 days later, produces a level of operational clarity that neither source produces alone. The targeting precision attributed to Israel's 2025 military campaign against Iran, strikes that reached figures whose locations should, by any standard assessment, have been protected, was not the product of any single source. Intelligence of that quality is always composite. It is always the result of multiple streams converging on the same picture from different angles. She was one angle. The consequences of that angle were not abstract. Senior IRGC commanders were killed in operations that required foreknowledge of their movements and positions. A drone base was established near Tehran. Air defense systems were struck with a precision that implied knowledge of their configuration that went beyond what technical surveillance alone would produce. These outcomes had names attached to them, real people, in real positions, with families who are now absent a husband or a father or a son. The intelligence she passed did not pull any trigger. The chain between what she heard in a living room in Tehran and what happened to the men whose wives she knew is long, and involves decisions made by people whose names are not part of this account. But the chain exists. It is not hypothetical. The 3 men executed by Iranian authorities in the period following the exposure of her alleged role were not commanders. They were peripheral figures, individuals whose connection to her operation was partial at best, whose guilt was asserted by a security apparatus searching for accountability in a situation where the actual accountability was already beyond its reach. Their executions were the fallout settling on people who happened to be standing in the wrong place in the institutional wreckage. This is how intelligence failures are processed in closed states. Not with accuracy, with proximity. Iran launched a formal manhunt. Her image was distributed. The women who had known her as Fatime were interviewed, some formally, some through the social pressure that substitutes for formal procedure in environments where the distinction between the two is not always maintained. Zara was among them. What Zara said in those interviews is not documented. What she understood in the process of those interviews about the woman she had called at 11 at night, that understanding has no record. But it exists. In the gap between what a person believed was a friendship and what that friendship actually was. There is a specific kind of damage that does not heal through explanation, because no explanation exists that makes it different from what it was. The institutional cost to Iran was significant and acknowledged, if reluctantly, in the post-mortems of the 2025 war. Former President Ahmadinejad had said years earlier that Mossad was closer to Iran than its own ear. Former Intelligence Minister Younisi had said it publicly. The apparatus had been warned that its social world was not closed in the way it believed it was closed. The warning had not produced adequate structural change. The cost of that failure was measured in the precision of strikes that should not have been possible. The personal cost is harder to calibrate. She has spoken since her exposure in terms that are careful and controlled. She does not perform regret, and she does not perform certainty. She describes, in fragments, a life that was lived as two things simultaneously for long enough that the two things can no longer be fully separated. The prayer mat she used every morning for 6 years, she did not leave it behind when she left Tehran. This is a small detail. It is not a small thing. She has said, in the only extended interview she gave following the exposure, that she does not know how to characterize what she believed during those 6 years. Whether the practice was performance that became habit, or something the word habit does not adequately describe. She said, the two things were not always different. That is where the official record ends. But there is a category of this story that no intelligence post-mortem captures. The operations that preceded this one. The women and men who built the methods she inherited. The cases that established, over decades, that the most impenetrable target in the world is not a nuclear facility or a military compound. It is a household. And the cases that proved, at considerable human cost, that households can be entered not through force, not through signals, but through the oldest mechanism available to any intelligence service, a person willing to become someone else entirely, for long enough that the someone else becomes real. Those cases are not in any public file. Some of them are in the ebook mentioned in the description below. The Mossad files we put together cover the operations that built the doctrine this woman was trained inside. The deep cover methods, the honeypots, the long legends, the cases where the deception worked and the cases where it didn't, and what the difference between those outcomes actually was. Not the sanitized version, the operational one. The link is in the description. If this story held your attention, what is in that document will hold it considerably longer. Leave a comment below with one word. What do you think it actually takes to dismantle a closed world from the inside? We will be in the comments,